Former Maryland Congressman John Delaney is calling for a unified message from the Democratic Party when it comes to the economy. While speaking to reporters in Iowa last week, Delaney said Democrats need to make it clear they will do everything possible to avert a recession.
Meanwhile, the presidential hopeful continues working on qualifying for the September Democratic debates. Recently, Mr. Delaney placed his campaign manager in charge of efforts in Iowa and brought his former chief of staff in to run the campaign. John Delaney joins us now to discuss all of this. Congressman, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Congressman, tell us about your efforts right now to qualify. I think that's what all the eyes on are here. Mm-hmm. Are you on a path in order to get on the stage?
I think we're on a path to get in the fourth debate. Mm-hmm. The third debate qualification cutoff is this week. I don't think we'll make the third debate.
Mm-hmm. And so what is your goal to remain in the race? I mean, we've seen some of these candidates that have bowed out. You seem to be trying to unshift the Overton window, I guess, and the way that we talk a lot about these issues. What is it that you see as your purpose in remaining within this race?
Well, my purpose is to win it. Mm-hmm. So I think what's going to happen is the field's going to shrink. I think it'll shrink dramatically, and that'll benefit me. I'm going to stay in the race, and I'm going to talk about an economic message that a majority of the American people can get behind. That's what we need to beat Trump, and that's what we need to be to ultimately govern.
Okay.
And that's what I'm running on.
Yeah. And so where are you running? You just mentioned you were up in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. How's that going?
It's going well, and I'm going to Iowa next week. So, I mean, I've done 30 trips to Iowa.
What are the voters saying when they come to your events? You think that your voters, the people who are showing up at your events, are different people that are coming to Bernie Sanders events or Elizabeth Warren's events when she's in the
Probably
States?
some different, probably some the same. I mean, a lot of people, go to see all the candidates,
they
right?
date a lot
because they're pros.
Yeah.
Right? That's what they do for a living in Iowa, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
But I obviously get a lot of voters who want common sense solutions. They want real solutions. They know some of the stuff that some of these folks are running on are impossible promises or fairy tale economics. They'll never happen, and we can't win if we run on those things.
Are you going to South Carolina? Have you spent time down there?
Yeah, I've done about half a dozen trips to South Carolina.
How's it going down there?
It's going well. I mean, I've spent less time there than I have in Iowa and New Hampshire.
So why not spend more time in South Carolina? They're the third state that's big. They're a very diverse state. Democratic primary requires winning diverse audience.
Again, I've been there half a dozen times. Yeah. So I've been there a fair amount. It's just a lot less than Iowa. I mean, obviously I'm prioritizing Iowa than New Hampshire, so I'm kind of going.
So that's the strategy that seems to be here. Do you worry that you're going to be falling into a 2016 trap? I mean, one of the main things that we saw there was that President Trump ultimately only had 33% like that percent of the vote, but because there were so many other candidates that it spread out the rest of the margin and it made it so that he was a lock for the nomination. Now, if you really believe that Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, other people are threats to the party, why not let some of this vote coalesce around a candidate who might actually beat the person who you think is a threat?
Because I think we have to have a discussion around ideas. I mean, I was the first person to call out Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. And I did it in San Francisco at the California convention, and I was booed.
Yeah.
And I said then, I remember someone asked me, I said, I'd rather be booed than the Democratic Party get health care policy wrong. And look what's happened in 2 months. Pretty much all the candidates are now backing away from the pure Medicare for all bill that Senator Sanders put forth. Even he's backed away from it. And I'm sure in the next month, Elizabeth Warren's going to do some announcement where she talks about universal health care, but it's not Medicare for all. So that's the point. We actually need to talk about this stuff. We need to talk about the ideas, how we move forward. We can't beat Trump on some of these crazy things that they're putting forth. And I think that's part of the primary process. And I think I'm doing that better than anyone.
Another interesting thing that has come out of San Francisco this week is there was a resolution to stop single-issue debates, particularly on the issue of climate. As a candidate yourself, how do you feel about that decision?
I don't think it's a great decision. I mean, look, I think the DNC is micromanaging this process way too much. It feels to me like they're trying to pick the candidate. I mean, this 130,000 donor thing that they put forth really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
All it does is create an incentive for the party to run on extreme issues because that's what raises you money online. And I think for the DNC to say that the candidates can't engage in a climate debate, how does that possibly make sense? I think we should have a climate debate. We should have a healthcare debate. We should debate the issues that the American people want us to debate.
All right, so
not, what the DNC thinks we should debate.
Yeah,
so we saw Jay Inslee get out of the race.
Yes.
He clearly was the person who had the biggest voice on climate change.
Yes.
Talked about it a lot. What's your climate change policy?
So it starts with a carbon tax. And I introduced this bill in the Congress on a bipartisan basis. And again, that's what makes me different than anyone else in this field. I have a big climate plan, but I'm the only one who has shown a way to actually get it done. So I put a price on carbon. That'll cut emissions by 90%. I take all the revenues and I give it right back to the American people. So it's called a carbon fee and dividend proposal.
So what, a tax cut?
Well, no, they get basically a dividend. So we put a price on carbon, raises $3 trillion over 10 years. It is modeled to reduce carbon emissions by 90%. All of that money goes in a lockbox. The government can't touch it. And every American gets an equal dividend check every year. So it goes out one pocket in the form of higher energy prices and discouraging the use of fossil fuels, and then it goes right back in their pockets in terms of an annual dividend.
So
that's the kind of bill you can get passed in the Congress.
Maybe, but I mean that's an interesting policy. But I think it really is.
Let me tell you how you get it. Real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
Every Democrat and the Republicans who live in coastal states. Period. Right. If you want to do something on climate, that's your coalition. All the Democrats and the Republicans in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, those are the Republicans that have to do something on climate.
And you don't want to do anything around investing in solar, investing in any of the technology that we need to solve the problem.
So that's the first part of my climate plan. The second thing is a 5-fold increase in the Department of Energy research budget, because unless we come up with new technologies, we're never going to get to net zero.
But if you're giving all the money back, how are you going to spend any more money on these investments?
Well, you get money on those investments from other things that I would change in the tax code. I'm also going to create a market for something called negative emissions technologies. These are machines that actually suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. They exist, they're proven. The problem is they're just subscale. The way to solve that is to create a market for them, just like we did in wind and solar. If you create a market for something, then the private sector innovates, scales up. Because the thing about climate, it's a global issue. And unless the United States of America creates the technologies that can get the world off fossil fuels, we will never solve this problem.
Congressman, I do wonder, there is a new NBC Wall Street Journal poll out that shows that historic anger amongst the U.S. electorate at the current system, at the way that domestic politics are operated. Even 43% of Americans said it very well describes them, that they are angry at things that are happening. As somebody who's running much more in an establishmentarian way, why do you think that yours is the answer to fulfill that deep hatred of the system fundamentally that exists within the American people right now?
So I'm actually I'm not running on it. I'm not I was an outsider. I mean, I was in business. I'm relatively new to politics. I'm running on getting things done. That's what the American people should be utterly furious about. That over the last several decades, the world has changed tremendously because of globalization and technological innovation. And there's obvious things we should have done as a society or as a federal government to prepare our citizens for that. And we didn't do any of them. And what happened? Huge numbers of the American people got left behind. That should be what they're pissed about, which is why didn't you improve public education? Why didn't you improve healthcare? Why didn't you build infrastructure to connect us to the world? Why didn't you change the tax code to encourage people to invest in my community? Because last year, 80% of the venture capital went to 50 counties in this country, out of 3,100. Right? If you're not in those 50 counties, you're furious. But we could have actually done things. Well, that's what they should be furious about, which is that we didn't do anything.
So you seem to acknowledge that some of these globalized policies, TPP, NAFTA, and
I'm a huge supporter of TPP.
I know, and well, that's what I'm curious about, which is you seem to support the policies which have rooted out much of our middle class, and yet your solution is the job training promise, which never has actually materialized.
That's not my solution. My solution, for example, on trade is infrastructure and real policies to invest money. Because this is what happens. Unless someone invests, right, no jobs get created. So when we become part of a global economy, people have moved jobs out of communities and moved them internationally. That was pulling investment capital out of a community. The only way to offset that is to have policies that cause investments in those communities, not job training. You have to do that, but that's not going to create the jobs. What's going to create the jobs is building infrastructure, creating incentives like the legislation I led in the Congress, this opportunity zone legislation, which actually creates a real incentive for people to invest. I always think the way we should be framing this is we need to think globally, because we're of course in a global economy, and we can't stick our head in the sand like Trump is and like Elizabeth Warren wants to and like Bernie Sanders want to, but we have to invest locally.
So here's what I like about what you came here to do today. When your centrism, we're situating you in this land of moderates and centrists, but you didn't come here to talk about this false process centrism that we hear a lot from people who run, like, oh, we're just going to all sit down at the table with Republicans and we'll find a way to make it work. You actually seem to have some ideas about what it is that you want to do. Why are people paying more attention to these ideas?
Because I think maybe because they're common sense. I hate to say they're not extreme. They don't vilify Republicans. I mean, fundamentally, my ideas have nothing to do with the vilification of Republicans. My ideas are about how do we solve the problems. that are facing the American people. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, and I think it'll change, which is why I'm staying in the race, that's not what sells. What sells is trying to, who does a better job at demonizing Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell and Trump are a symptom of a disease. If it wasn't those two, it would be two other people. The disease is a broken government that doesn't do anything. See, in business, I used to have this expression: the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. We think if we sit on our hands and argue all the time that it's fine. Well, it's actually not fine. What happens is the world changes and people get left behind.
So we got to bring
that's the central issue.
We got to bring him back to hear more about how he wants to fix the broken government.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thanks for
Congressman.
having me.
Really interesting.
Thanks a lot.
Next on Rising, in the second quarter of 2019, the RNC brought in $105 million with its fundraising efforts. That sum is almost twice what the party raked in at the same time last year.
There's probably a reason for that. We'll tell you about that and what the RNC's plans are to increase the party's ground game heading into 2020 right here when Rising continues.